If you believe in God, and I do, you must declare resistance evil, for it prevents us from achieving the life God intended when He endowed each of us with our own unique genius. That's from Steven Pressfield in his book, The War of Art. And he continues, we can't be anything we want to be. We come into this world with a specific personal destiny. We have a job to do, a calling to enact, a self to become. We are who we are from the cradle, and we're stuck with it. Our job in this lifetime is not to shape ourselves into some ideal we imagine we ought to be, but to find out who we already are and become it. If we were born to paint, it's our job to become a painter. If we were born to raise and nurture children, it's our job to become a mother. If we were born to overthrow the order of ignorance and injustice of the world, it's our job to realize it and get down to business. I'm Chad Brooks, and this is Season 1 of the Productive Pastor Podcast. What is up, my friends? Chad's here. I'm stoked to spend this time with you. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1 of the Productive Pastor Podcast. And this episode's all about being personally aware and how that affects our productivity. You know, as we got things kicked off, I read a quote from Steven Pressfield from his book, The War of Art. You know, the subtitle of this whole season is 11 Strategies Against Time-Bound Resistance. And I cannot wait to share this stuff with you. And all of this is a result of the last few years as I've been on a journey from being a workaholic to someone who is more mindful of my health and how my vocational life affects alongside of this. And I'm not here as some sort of productivity expert, but just another pastor alongside of you in the journey. So I can't wait to jump off into this with you. So no one's art is the same. And no one's ministry is the same, but really we're all fighting the same battle for the sake of kingdom work. Years ago, I read Steven Pressfield's The War of Art that I quote at the beginning of this. And in this book, Pressfield uses this analogy of the resistance to talk about the opposable force that stops so many of us from being able to accomplish not only what we set out to do, but what we are created to do. And Pressfield talks about how the resistance is the very thing that stands between the life we have and the life we are created for. Now, I think that's a fantastic metaphor, not just for ministry and productivity, but really understanding the purpose and the role of all of that in the Christian life, or as us theological Wesleyans like to call it, sanctification. Now, Pressfield tells in the book that he is a believer in Jesus Christ, and I would not read this book as a Christian book per se, but man, the way Pressfield talks about this whole resistance thing makes a lot of sense. And there's also a broader part of this conversation that I think a lot of times as ministers, we understand that this is a called life. That's a phrase that I've used a lot around Productive Pastor, is living out the called life together. But sometimes I think we take on this idea of subservience or servanthood or all of that whole sort of conversation, and we really forget what does it mean to live a life that is well lived, a life that is inspiring, a life that is healthy, a life that's all those sorts of things. And we think because we're in ministry that somehow those two just don't coexist. At least that's what I thought for years. And I've been, reframing that so much in my own life. So I wanted to share that quote from Pressfield and why the subtitle of this whole first season is talking about the resistance and these things that stop us from living this full life. If God called us to be in ministry, then shouldn't this be creating a full life for us as well? So what we're going to do over the next 11 episodes is we're going to be talking about strategies against time-bound resistance, the specific stopping things that time and that vocation, the way that we are dealing with this is as this resistance. And as I talked about in the preview episodes, and if you've not gone and listened to those yet, there's a couple of them. There's a short one and there's a long one. These aren't so much about getting things done or even necessarily getting the right things done, but understanding how a personal practice of productivity actually is holy work. And for those of us who are in vocational ministry, it's about us understanding the personal and the spiritual growth side of us following this call from God. So that's what we're going to be doing together. And before we jump into a more specific conversation about being personally, I want to tell you about a resource that I've created for this season. You can go to the show notes of this episode. You can go over to revchadbrooks.com or other places I'm talking about a lot. But I've created a premium workbook that's going to go alongside this entire season. Every episode has a companion module. There's a companion video as part of each module. There are worksheets. It's all sorts of things. If the podcast episodes are about the what and the why, the workbook is about the how. And for the first 48 hours of episode one's release, you can pick this up for $10. After those first 48 hours, it's going to be $30 for the duration of this entire season. But it's almost, I think, 95 pages. Each video is about 10 minutes long, so you have over an hour of content there. If you really want to dig deep into what does it mean to do this, and I love a super practical, tactical, tangible way of doing things. If that sounds interesting to you, go cruise over and pick up the workbook in the show notes. You can find it there. And so we're going to get back on with the rest of the thing. Let's get started with the content for this episode right now. Okay. And this is what it's going to be about. It's about building up a level of personal awareness in us. And the first step to working on any sort of productivity or time management, betterment plan, whatever you want to call it, is to have a good idea of what the current state of things is. And not just doing this one time and calling it done, but consistently building in patterns of reflection and awareness, of thinking about things like what makes me work well. What am I currently working on? What's working well in my life, and what affects that or not? What can cause a good day or a bad day in my life? Thinking about what types of my ministry are personally fulfilling to me, and what parts of ministry are absolutely draining to me. To think and ask ourselves the questions, how well am I taking care of myself? And then finally, and for anyone who follows Jesus, this is an important question, but for somebody who's in ministry, it's an absolutely crucial question, is this: is your spiritual life where it needs to be? So building personal awareness. I think there's power in asking ourselves questions. And so let's talk about a few parts of those. The first one is this: our soul. John Wesley would always ask that question, how is it with your soul, as part of his discipleship practice. So where are you right now? How's your soul? Take a couple minutes, hit pause on your phone or however you're listening to the podcast, and just think about that. Are you in a negative space right now? Are you in a positive space right now? Maybe you're somewhere in the middle. And I think one of the things that I've learned over the last few years is that my daily expectation of myself has the ability to shape and shift. And while I think there is a line between self-care and laziness, part of working well in a vocational sense is understanding what we are capable of in the moment. The day that you are having, or maybe the hour that you are having. Developing a mature sense of who you are, of what you're good at, and in the moment that you're in right now, what is the absolute best thing that you can be contributing to the whole. And I think it's totally acceptable to give ourselves permission to define things in terms of what is possible at this moment. It's one of the biggest lessons that I have learned, and that deeply affects our soul and who we are. Learning to think about those things and build those things up, it helps us to not lose ourselves and lose our identity as we are serving others. The second thing is defining the work. It's about our pre-planning and our off-ramping. I will say this a lot, and there's something about ministry that happened. It happened early in my career, but I've talked with folks that it happens all throughout it. This is a weird job because sometimes we ask ourselves the question, what should I be doing right now? Or like, what is the next thing for me to be doing? Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a friend who talked about, we were talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's ministry for the year. He was a pastor in Spain, and what that looked like, and how we'd both had times in ministry where we had been able to just have really softly defined schedules and a lot of time around us to be in ministry alongside with each other. So in kind of some words saying the things we actually wanted to be in ministry for, not the work side of this job. But defining the work allows us to really begin to do that. So how often are you sitting down to plan out your work? How often do you evaluate your work, and not evaluate saying I did a good job today, but saying, okay, is this the best use of my time, or is that really effective, or is this critical, or is this not critical? Just defining the work and that sort of thing, and evaluating it. Or do you set and do you work towards goals that you have, or do you just shoot from the hip? Shooting from the hip means hitting everything. And sometimes you might hit what you want to, and then other times you're going to hit tons of stuff you don't want to, and then other times it's just going to fly off into nowhere. Shooting from the hip means hitting nothing. Understanding goals, and I'll be honest with you, in a couple of episodes, I'm going to kind of knock on goals a little bit, but goals matter. Goals is a way of thinking, because goals mean that we're planning ahead, that we're thinking about our preferred future, that sort of thing. But goals allow us to define our work. Goals also allow us to focus on our work. And goals, when they are best planned, and we're going to talk about that a lot this season, they are aligned around not just our strengths, but also the ministry's needs. And goals keep us from wasting our work. So lastly, your context, your leadership, the ministry that you serve, and the Holy Spirit, that's what defines good work for you. This isn't wins, this isn't successes, this sort of thing. It's about faithfulness. And you create a measuring stick of what matters. And when we're listening to the Holy Spirit, we're tuned in, and not just you, but together. You'll begin to build up an awareness of defining, hey, this is the absolute most important thing for me to be doing right now. Not just chasing the ministry rabbits that sound good from a podcast, even my podcast, or whatever the last book you read or conference you reached to. Creating that measuring stick is what helps you just drive yourself. For me, as a person who is extremely apostolic and evangelistic, one of my measuring sticks is this reaching new people? And is this making people feel comfortable in the church when they have not felt comfortable in the church before? That's one of my measuring sticks. It's a thing that we filter through when we're personally aware of who we are, when we're personally aware and we're congregationally aware, we're able to define the work that we have laying out in front of us. The next thing to think about is this: who are you wired to be? Now, I'm a massive fan of assessments, especially Gallup Strength Finders. I also love the DISC test. I like any sort of evaluations. The Enneagram, I've done that. All this sorts of thing. But the more we take these things, they all begin to make sense. I'm more crazy about outward types of assessments. Like if I have to put, if I have to put Strength Finders and the Enneagram into a cage match, I'm going to pick Strength Finders. But all that to say, the more we understand how we work, the more we understand who we are, the more we understand how we are wired, the more self-aware we will be, especially when we're in this emotionally draining job like ministry. I was in vocational ministry full-time under my first appointment in the United Methodist Church, maybe for a year and a half, around that time. And I was completely exhausted. I felt like I was a failure at things. And I went to take this, I was going to a church planting a residency and assessment course, and we took the DISC test. And I had taken the DISC test before in seminary, but I'd not really paid that much of attention to it. And we weren't with someone who was DISC certified. Like, sidebar, having a person who's actually certified in the test is a fantastic thing. But we took the DISC test, and the DISC test came back, and the trainer was walking around, and they saw my DISC. And they began laughing at me. And I was like, what's so funny? Is this horrible? And they said, no. And they looked at me and they said, compassion is a difficult thing for you, isn't it? And I kind of stopped and I was like, well, what are you talking about? And they said, I'm looking at your disc test right now. And there are certain types of ministry that are really, really difficult for you, aren't they? And I said, well, like, what are you talking about? And the person just looked at me and said, he said this, I think it was on the lines of, you don't have 5 to 6 deeply personal pastoral care conversations a week, do you? And I looked back and I was like, yeah, I'm so bad at that sort of a thing. And at that moment, something clicked, and I realized that I had spent the last year and a half trying to be the same type of pastor of the person I was replacing, who had completely different gifts than I did. And it was just wearing me out trying to be them. And the disc test helped me realize, okay, these are the things that you are naturally predisposed to be doing. And that was my first time I ever learned that there's something fulfilling inside of knowing who we are and making sure we're able to be oriented towards that. And then I've got a lot of stories over the last couple of years. I'll tell you, in the last 2 years, I hired a Gallup strengths coach, and that strengths coach was as helpful, if not more helpful, than my therapist in helping me understand the way things were working out for me in that moment. So understanding who you are wired to be is really important. The fourth thing is this, and there's these 3 categories that I've thought about so much over the last couple of years as I've tried to get my head around work in a way that is healthier, and they're this. There's draining tasks, there's dealing tasks, and there's developing tasks. And I've been working on this for the last couple of months, and I'm not even close to done with it. And you'll hear about these a lot over this season. But these are 3 types of tasks that I think each of us spend our time doing. You know, draining tasks are just that. They're tasks that absolutely drain us. Dealing tasks are okay. Think of the phrase when you say, I can deal with that. Now, it might not be ideal, but it's an accepted thing. And then there are developing tasks. These are tasks that are not just when we are at our best, but the ones that absolutely continue to develop the best of who we are. Now, over in the workbook for episode 1, I go in deeper into the idea of draining, dealing, and developing tasks. We also have some questions and some work towards figuring out what are the things that we do in ministry that make us really happy, where we are at our best, where we're doing the things that we're doing. But then also, what are the things that we do that we might not like doing and that actually has the ability to kind of break away at our identity? There's a lot of just fun, good questions to think about those sorts of things. And so if this is interesting, make sure you cruise over to the show notes and go grab the workbook, especially for the next 48 hours. If you're hearing this very, very quickly, it's only $10. That's like a nickel a page or something like that. I don't know. It's wildly cheap. So to wrap things up, just one call to action is this. Think about the questions we ask in this episode. You might want to gather around any assessments that you have ever done and taken. If you've never done one of those before, I would start out with the Gallup Strength Finders. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. And I'd spring for the full 34. I think knowing the 5 least strengths is just as interesting, if not more helpful, than knowing your top 5 strengths. But gather together the assessments you've taken, the questions that I've asked here in this episode, and just begin thinking about who are you and what is your relationship inside of work from a vocational sense. You know, you might never have tried to put that together before. The second call to action is this. If you really, really like this, go pick up the workbook, because there are so many practical things that are part of every one of these episodes. And there's resources that are there for that, just to begin wrapping your head around each single topic more. And so I love the fact that how this introduces the draining, the dealing, and the developing tasks. So a couple of recommended resources that I used as I was developing this content, as I was thinking about this, is this. So The War of Art by Steven Pressfield, which I quoted in the very beginning of this episode. It's a short little book. It's the kind of book that you can read on your phone while you're sitting at the counter at Waffle House. You can dip in and out of it, but it's been tremendously influential to me for a very long time. Then there's Carey Nieuwhof's newest book, At Your Best. I actually picked this book up after I developed out the content for this whole season, and I read it when I was in the deer stand this year. And I was very happy, to see the fact that he's coming to some of the same conclusions. There's a little bit of proof of concept there, but I really loved, and I went in and refined some of the things I thought about, especially in the way that Carey talks about yellow days, red days, and green days. Really, really good stuff. That's a simple, easy book. Like I said, I read it in the deer stand. Nothing too crazy. Henry Cloud has a great book called Boundaries for Leaders, and I read this a couple of years back when I was going through a really tough mental season of life. But what Cloud talks about is that as a leader, if we don't have focus, if we don't know our why, if we don't know the intention behind things, everything else going to kind of seem to be pretty crazy. And then finally, Campbell Walker's book, Your Head is a Houseboat. Great, great book about journaling and mindfulness. But I'm Chad Brooks. This is Productive Pastor, and it's great to have this going on again, and I will see you back in the next episode.